Thanks for being here, Merrick. Merrick Kaiser, my videographer on site. So anyway, Don, what's your full name?
My name is Donald Henry Wolfe. I was born in 1921 in Aberdeen, South Dakota. I was named Donald Henry. My father's name was Henry, and during the period when I was growing from infancy up, they called my dad Hank, and they called me Little Hank. Even though my name was Donald, they called me Hank, Little Hank. Oh, I thought it was a little strange because my parents didn't do that. This was neighbors and friends that seemed to think it was funny to call me Hank.
Well,
I got very interested in aircraft when I was just a young tad. I was reading books about World War I and the pilots that were flying then, and it got me interested in becoming a pilot. The more I read, the more eager I became, and in 1935, I happened to be out on a hunting expedition with my father and a neighbor when we, by extreme good luck, happened to be in the right place to see the landing of the Endeavour balloon that had risen to a new altitude record, and it was coming down right in the area where we were hunting pheasants. We were among the first people to arrive at the scene when they landed on the, and we were excited to see this balloon lying there, and I asked my father for his pocket knife so I could cut a piece out of that balloon, which I was doing right when Captain Stevens and Anderson came out of the gondola and told me to get away from their damn balloon. Oh. That's not exactly the word they used, but they were cussing me out for cutting a hole in their balloon. Outside of a little town that was about 20 or 25 miles west of where we were living in Mitchell, South Dakota, and they landed out on a farm there. We happened to be in that area, so there were thousands of people following that balloon. I couldn't believe the line of traffic that we could see coming down the country roads to get to that landing site, and by the time that we left there must have been 3,000 or 4,000 people all gathered around the landing site where that balloon was. But when Captain Anderson and Stevens came out of that gondola, I turned to my father and I said, "That's what I got to be, an Air Corps pilot." Of course, the pilots in the Air Service at that time were all Army, because the Army was the controlling entity for the flight section. The Army at that time, of course, had numerous classifications. There was the artillery and the tanks and the Air Corps and all sorts of different divisions of the Army, and it didn't become the Air Force until 1947. By then, I had served in the service for several years. I'll get more into that in a moment, but
it was books that inspired you. It was reading that inspired your entrance into the Air Force.
It was the reading of those pulp novels that were published in the 1920s about the pilots that were flying in World War I. That's what excited me most. Got me started.
What's your favorite title? Do you recall?
Oh, no, they were just a bunch of pulp magazines.
Okay.
I don't know anything. They were about the size of the National Geographic, but they were not published on such nice paper. It was pulp paper that they were published on. So but they had stories about Rickenbacker and all the other famous pilots from World War I, and that really excited me and from then on, I visited our local airport every time I could get to it. It was only a couple of miles out of town, but that meant I had to hitchhike out there, or though my mother and father would drive me out there once in a while if we saw airplanes flying in and out of the place. And it was somewhere around 1930 that a Bush pilot came flying in there in an old Ford trimotor aircraft. And he was taking people for rides in that around the city. And my mother gave me a couple of bucks to take a ride, and that was my first flight in an old Ford trimotor airplane. Really excited me.
Your first flight, what year was that?
It was around 1930. I can't recall exactly when it was, but
Bush plane. And
it was a trimotor. It looked like, as a matter of fact, the German Junker J-87, which was the transport plane that the Germans had during the war. It was a trimotor airplane that they ferried their troops around in. We had the DC-3, which was the old C-47 DC-3 aircraft made by Douglas. That was our main transport during the war, and the Germans had the Ju-87, which was that trimotor. Their paratroopers flew in that. Our paratroopers flew in the DC-3, or the C-47, as we called it.
So you got in the Air Force before World War II reached Pearl Harbor, correct?
Oh, I hitchhiked in 1939 from Mitchell to Sioux Falls to visit the recruiter. Well, there was none in Mitchell, but there was one in Sioux Falls. And I told him that I wanted to get into the Army Air Corps and go to flight school. And he advised me that I could not go to flight school because I had no college. That in order to get into flight school, I had to have at least 2 years of college or have a degree, they preferred. But he said there is a school at Fort Snelling that you can go to, and when you graduate from that, you'll be eligible to go to flight school. That was not factual, but it's what he told me. So I decided that I would enlist right then, and when I started to sign the papers, he asked for my age, and I told him that when I was born, and he said, well, you're not old enough to get in the Army Air Corps. You're only 17 years old. He said, I can sign you up to be called when you pass your 18th birthday, which we did.
Okay.
So I went back to my home and waited till they sent me orders to join the service in September 30th when I passed 18. Shortly thereafter, I got the orders from headquarters to go to Fort Snelling, Minnesota, where the guy had told me I'd get into flight school by going to a class there. But when I got there, it was not for that. It was a school for congressional appointees to West Point. That's what that school was for, and I wasn't an appointee to West Point, so I wasn't eligible for the school.
So how did you get
they
in?
just put me in the infantry.
So you went infantry at first.
I was in the infantry for about a week. I didn't want to be in the infantry. I told my commander that I didn't want to be in that outfit. I wanted to be in the Army Air Corps. And he said, well, you're in the infantry now. And I went to visit my aunt and uncle who happened to be living there. One of my mother's sisters lived there in Minneapolis, and so I went to visit them a couple of weeks after I was signed up and told my uncle that I was very unhappy being in the infantry. And he said, well, I'll see if I can do something for you. I have no idea who he knew or how he knew anybody, but within 2 weeks, I was transferred from the infantry into the quartermaster corps. And that was at least out of the infantry. I was still in the Army. I wasn't going to get into the Air Corps from there,
Quartermaster Corps. What's the quartermaster?
the quartermaster is the supply arm of the services of the Army.
Okay.
The Navy has their quartermaster too, but it's a different service, so a different group of people. But the quartermaster of the Army is the guy that supplies the service of housing and supplies to all of the needs of the Army. And so I was in that with not knowing anything about it. They sent me to a short familiarization school with the Minneapolis Honeywell Company, who had recently resupplied the entire base with new heating units for their housing and their buildings, a gas unit, and of course it had gauges and things on it that needed to be checked. And so they, being the new guy on the block, I got the job of every night running around the base checking all those instruments in all the houses, and they had to open their basements to me, but they all had outside entrances, so there was no problem. I could get into every building on the base by going down their basement stairs. And
about what year was this, Don?
this was in 1939.
Okay, so 1939, Hitler's invading Poland.
He invaded
and you're
Poland
changing thermostats.
Just before I got in, I was actually enlisted in September 30th. That's 30 days after he invaded Poland. But we weren't all that familiar with that stuff. We were here in the States, and the war had started in Europe, but we weren't involved with it at all. Well, our involvement was strictly supplying. We sympathized, of course, with the British and the French and the Poles, and we were supplying them with supplies, and of course Hitler didn't like that. He was sinking whatever ships he could that was with his U-boats, but we still managed to get many of them through to the bases in England. And then we actually sent some to Murmansk in Russia, too, to supply the Russians. As a matter of fact, I recently, I think it was within the last 6 months, I've learned that Studebaker supplied Russia with over 3,000 trucks during the war. I didn't know about that till just a few weeks ago.
Where were you, Don, when you heard about Hitler's invasion of Poland, and did it grip you with fear? How'd you feel?
I had been transferred from Fort Snelling down to a new base that was just being built in Missouri called Fort Leonard Wood. And I was among the first soldiers down there. They sent quartermaster guys from several different bases to help get that base opened. And that's when we learned about the invasion. But that was actually not until 1940.
Okay.
I didn't even hear about it in Fort Snelling, though I'm surprised because I can remember back before ever getting in the Army myself that my father and mother used to listen to Hitler on the radio, and Dad would be cussing him out, saying that SOB's going to start a war. And I didn't really understand what was going on. I was more inclined to be inimical to the Japanese because I had read the newspapers that the Japanese had attacked China and the Philippines as early as 1931. That was when I was just a little kid.
Yeah.
And I was really angry with the Japanese because the articles we were reading and what I was hearing on the radio, they were brutalizing the unprotected cities of of China that had no army, and the Japanese were over there just pummeling them with bombs and killing and raping their way through the cities like they owned the place. I was really unhappy with the Japanese at that time, and frankly, I still am.
Well, speaking of the Japanese, Don, where were you sitting, when you heard of Pearl Harbor the first time?
Well, I'm down at Fort Leonard Wood. I'm in the office of the personnel management there that was the quartermaster. I was assigned there as a purchasing agent. I was supplying this base with, or I was letting the contracts for all of the athletic equipment to supply 7 different gyms that we had on the base, and the base theaters with their screens and their projectors and stuff. I was letting contracts for all that. We had a special fund called WEMA, that is Welfare Enlisted Men of the Army, and that fund was supplying all of this stuff for the enlisted men of the base. At this time, there was nobody on the base but those of us who were supplying the equipment. The regular soldiers hadn't been sent in there yet, but we were getting ready for them. And I was dating a girl that was working in an electrical contractor's office right across from my office. And she and her family had invited me up to Jefferson City, Missouri it was the capital of the state, and it was a few miles north of our base. And I was invited up there on Sunday morning for dinner on December 7th of 1941. And I was up there sitting down for dinner when there was a notice came over the radio that Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And we said, where the heck is Pearl Harbor? And my girlfriend's father was a lawyer up there, and he said, oh, that's out in Hawaii.
Oh, your girlfriend's father wasn't too concerned over the dinner table about this island bombing.
Well, he wasn't any happier than I was, except that I was even more unhappy because they said, all soldiers return immediately to your base. And I hadn't even had my dinner yet. But
oh, my goodness.
Like a good guy, I got up from the table and dashed back to the base, and we sat there for a couple of weeks wondering what's going to happen now.
What did you have for dinner?
I ate back in the base, and I don't remember what I had there.
You didn't get to finish your dinner?
No, I didn't. I was...
So I'm assuming you didn't get a little late-night kiss either.
A little what?
Late-night kiss.
No.
Oh.
No, I dashed back, and so what all the guys did that. We wanted to do what was right, and we thought we might be going to war any minute, but we didn't go at all for a while.
Yeah.
And
when did
I had previously applied for flight school with a notice that had been posted on our bulletin board that enlisted men could now apply for flight training. And if we graduated from flight school, we would be pilots, but we would not be officers. We'd graduate as staff sergeants. Well, I didn't care what my rank was. I just wanted to be a pilot. So I immediately signed up for it and was accepted. But when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, that got me there in a hurry. We left in January early after that. It was in September when I made the application, and I was still sitting there in December, and we finally got called as soon as the Japs declared their nonsense.
Wow.
So it was early in December or January that I was called to go to Decatur, or not Decatur, but Maxwell Field in Alabama. That's at, I can't think of the name of the town now. It's a big city.
You got your wings in Alabama?
No, that's where I started flight school. You go there for pre-flight.
Okay.
And from there, that was the headquarters of the training service anyhow. It was at Maxwell Field. And they sent us out from there to the various flight schools. And I was initially assigned to Class 42H. When they sent 42H to school, I thought I would be going right out. But when they eventually did get down to my name, they had run out of schools, so I was reassigned to Class 42I.
Ah.
And I eventually got out of there in March to go to flight school. I went to Decatur, Alabama for primary flight training and in March, and then from there we went to Augusta, Georgia for basic flight training, where we got a bigger, more powerful airplane to fly, and from there we went to Valdosta, Georgia to advanced flight training, where we got twin engine airplanes to fly. Meanwhile, I had asked to be sent to fighter training, but they said I was too tall. I'd have to go to bomber training. So they sent me to twin engine school, where but all the others got to go to, that were shorter, got to go to single engine flight training for fighters.
So you piloted what I understand to be a very problematic craft.
B-26.
B-26. The B-26 Marauder, medium class
that's
bomber.
That's a medium bomber, yes.
Talk about.
Well, I'll get to that because there's a precursor to the assignment there. In I think it was August of 1942. We were due to graduate in October, and August or September, I'm not sure which date it was exactly. We were told to stand down from all our training on a particular day, and we had no idea what was going on. But what happened was a B-26 bomber came flying in on one engine and landed on our base, and a major and a civilian pilot from the plant in Maryland, I think it was Maryland, anyhow, they came to try and recruit people to volunteer to fly that airplane. We had no idea what was going on with it, but we did get some rumors when they talked to us about this airplane that it was giving problems with killing people on takeoff, because it was crashing so often. When they lose an engine, they lose control of the airplane, and it would crash in a bay at Tampa. And they actually created a saying, "One a day in Tampa Bay," because so many airplanes were crashing into the bay.
One a day in Tampa Bay. It was a B-26 Widowmaker?
B-26 Marauder. It was a great airplane, but they were learning how to fly it, and actually the instructors were teaching bad methods, wrong methods for flying the airplane on takeoff. It was very powerful. It had two of the biggest engines on any airplane that had been built. At that time, there were no aircraft that had 2,000 horsepower engines on them. We had two of them. So when one of them failed, there was a lot of power on the other side of the airplane, which would cause it to roll over. If one of them should suddenly quit, the airplane would roll upside down very rapidly. You had to be prepared for that. And the instructors at the time did not know how to teach that. They had no experience with anything like that.
And you practiced that over and over.
And fortunately, I managed to get checked out as a first pilot without crashing. I never had a lost engine. However, there was a problem coming from a different plant that was supplying the electrical power for the engines that would fail and cause the engine to stop when it would suddenly lose what do you call it? A seal that would break and flood the thing with oil, and it would stop the engine. And then when that happened, the aircraft would roll upside down very rapidly if you didn't immediately apply a lot of rudder. Well, the instructors were not teaching them to sit close enough to apply full rudder, and that was the problem. They didn't have the rudder control to stop the roll, and it was killing people. After I was checked out in it, the first flight I was up with well, I actually have to stop and tell you that when you were checked out as a first pilot, the first thing that happened was they sent you up with another brand new pilot who had never flown in one before to get him familiar with the airplane. And I had a brand new guy came to fly with me on the first day after I was checked out as a first pilot. And when we got up in the air, I told him that I was going to practice single engine. And I did that because I recognized that the way the instructor had checked me out was fallacious. The way he told me to get to a single engine condition was he pulled the throttle back, or he had me pull the throttle back just a slight bit. And then the aircraft would start to yaw a little bit, and he'd say, trim it up. So then I'd get the airplane trimmed so it would fly straight and level with that throttle off a little bit, and he'd pull it back a little bit more. So the airplane would again attempt to turn, and he'd tell me to trim it up, and I'd get it trimmed. And finally, after doing this for a half a dozen times, we had the throttle all the way off. Now I'm on single engine. I told this fellow that was flying with me after we got up in the air, that's no way to do that, because the engine doesn't quit that way. The way it quits is all at once. It's pulling out full power, and then it quits, it's pulling out nothing. So that's the way you have to work with it.
An instantaneous maneuver. Did you modify your seat forward?
What I did was I pushed my seat to the position where actually I had done this on the ground. I had adjusted my seat so that I could push the rudder all the way forward, either direction, depending on which engine might fail. I wanted to have full rudder control. I said, it doesn't do any good to do it a little bit at a time, because the engine isn't going to quit that way. You have to be able to jab it right now, or you're going to be upside down.
Right now, or your life's over?
Right now, or you're dead.
At any altitude, pretty much?
It will do the same thing at altitude, but the problem was